Jasmine Turner sat at the head of a gleaming conference table, her sharp eyes scanning the room filled with board members and high-level executives. As the CEO of Horizon Financial, she had built a billion-dollar empire, but it hadn't come easily. Every step of her ascent had been met with barriers, subtle, systemic ones that tried to keep her in the shadows of a male-dominated industry. Today, she was the powerful leader of one of the most respected financial institutions in the country, yet she couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. Her company, despite its success, was plagued with deep-rooted issues. Jasmine knew that the wealth she had accumulated was not just the result of her brilliance. It was also built on a foundation that wasn't as solid as it appeared. For years, she had battled behind closed doors, fighting not only to prove her worth, but to challenge an industry that had been slow to embrace true diversity. She had worked tirelessly to shatter glass ceilings, but even at the top, she couldn't ignore the unsettling whispers and the lingering doubts that hung over the company's practices. The more Jasmine learned, the more she realized that her company, and by extension the financial sector as a whole, still had a long way to go in ensuring true equity. She couldn't sit idly by any longer. Jasmine's mind was already made up. It was time to see for herself what was happening on the ground, in the branches where real decisions were being made, and where customers were being impacted. She could no longer trust the reports that were presented to her in board meetings or the polished speeches of her senior executives. It was time to dig deeper, to get answers. And so, with an unspoken determination, Jasmine made the bold decision to go undercover. Disguising herself as a regular customer, she would walk into Apex Bank, the very institution she owned, unannounced. It was a risky move, but Jasmine was no stranger to risk. If she was going to truly lead her company into a new era, she needed to understand its operations firsthand. And so, Jasmine set her plan in motion. She would visit the bank without anyone knowing who she was, without any special treatment or VIP access. It would be just her, a simple customer, in line with the rest. She wanted to see how Apex Bank treated people who didn't walk in with the power of her name attached to their transactions. She was ready to see the truth, even if it meant facing some uncomfortable revelations. As she prepared for her mission, Jasmine felt a sense of resolve that had guided her throughout her career. She knew that the battle for fairness was far from over, but she also knew that change couldn't begin without an honest look at the system that needed reform. Jasmine Turner wasn't just going to observe. She was ready to take action, no matter what she uncovered. She walked out of the boardroom that day with a clear sense of purpose. The fight she was about to engage in would not only shape the future of Horizon Financial, but could potentially change the entire landscape of the financial world. It was time to face the truth, no matter how hard it might be to swallow. Jasmine Turner stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the collar of her plain grey dress. She had spent years building Horizon Financial into a billion-dollar empire, but today, she was not going to be the powerful CEO. She was going to be just another customer, blending into the crowd. The decision she had made weighed heavily on her. She had spent countless hours in board meetings, discussing strategy and profit margins. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized that something fundamental was missing in her company's approach. The voices that had been silenced for too long, the people who had been overlooked or mistreated, were becoming impossible to ignore. Jasmine had always prided herself on her ability to navigate power and influence, but she had come to understand that true leadership required more than just financial acumen. It required a commitment to justice, fairness, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. She could no longer stand idly by, while the very institution she built continued to operate in ways that hurt marginalized communities. The whispers in the back of her mind had become impossible to silence, and so, with a quiet but firm resolve, Jasmine decided to take action. She would go undercover at Apex Bank, the very institution that she owned, and she would see firsthand how it operated, particularly when it came to the treatment of marginalized customers. She had worked tirelessly to build a reputation as a visionary leader, but now she needed to see how that reputation aligned with reality. If she truly wanted to make change, she had to understand what was happening on the ground. Her decision was not one she took lightly. She had been in the financial world long enough to know that what she was about to do could put her reputation, her career, and her company at risk. But Jasmine understood that in order to lead with integrity, she had to confront the very systems that she had been part of for so long. The fear of what she might discover only solidified her conviction to go through with it. Jasmine's plan was simple. She would visit an Apex Bank branch in Atlanta, where her own company had a strong presence, and she would do so without revealing her identity. She wanted to see the true face of the bank, away from the polished boardrooms, away from the formal meetings and staged press releases. She wanted to witness how the bank treated those who did not walk through the doors, with the weight of her name behind them. The decision to keep her identity hidden was deliberate. Jasmine knew that as soon as anyone recognized her, the entire dynamic would change. She didn't want special treatment. She wanted an honest assessment. If she was going to expose the systemic issues at play, she needed to witness it from the perspective of the customers, the people who were being affected. She spent hours preparing, not only in terms of the logistics of the visit, but also mentally. Jasmine knew the risks. What if the systems were even worse than she imagined? What if the practices of the bank ran deeper than she could have ever anticipated? She pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the mission at hand. She dressed simply, in a muted grey dress with no logos, no fancy accessories, and no tailored suits. Her goal was to blend in, to be just another customer in line, and for that, she needed to look nothing like the CEO of Horizon Financial. The simplicity of her outfit was purposeful. Nothing flashy, nothing to draw attention. She wanted to move through the branch unnoticed, to see how the bank truly operated when it didn't know who was watching. The final preparations were made, and Jasmine felt a surge of anticipation. She left her office, her steps steady and purposeful, determined to see for herself what was happening in the bank's branches, especially when it came to the treatment of minority communities. As she drove to the bank, Jasmine's mind raced. She had always known that the financial industry was rife with biases, but now she would see for herself how deep those biases went. The thought of confronting these issues head-on thrilled her, but it also scared her. She had built a career on breaking barriers, but now, in order to dismantle a broken system, she would have to confront the very institution she had created. It was a moment of reckoning, one that would change not only her, but the entire trajectory of her company. As Jasmine pulled into the parking lot of Apex Bank's Atlanta branch, she couldn't help but notice how the sleek, modern exterior of the building seemed to stand in stark contrast to the experiences she feared awaited her inside. She took a deep breath, adjusting her sunglasses as she walked toward the entrance, knowing this step would set the course for the future of her company. The next few hours would determine how far she was willing to go to root out the inequities that had persisted for so long. Jasmine Turner stepped through the automatic doors of Apex Bank, the cool air inside immediately wrapping around her like a quiet, sterile embrace. The sleek, polished floors gleamed under the bright fluorescent lights, and the modern design of the interior exuded an air of wealth and exclusivity. It was everything one would expect from a bank that catered to high-end clients. Yet, as she looked around, Jasmine couldn't help but notice the lack of diversity. The clientele was predominantly white, well-dressed individuals, each moving through the bank with ease, their transactions seemingly effortless. The contrast between the affluent, polished surroundings and the subtle discomfort that Jasmine felt was striking. This was her bank, the institution she had built, but today she was an observer, a silent witness to what happened when no one was looking. She stood in line, quietly watching the interactions between the tellers and customers. The service was fast, professional, and smooth, but there was an underlying sense of detachment. Jasmine could see the small, almost imperceptible differences in how the tellers engaged with the customers. A little more warmth for the older white man who came in for a simple transaction. A little more formality for the woman with the designer handbag. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the patterns seemed to emerge almost immediately. The employees seemed to take extra time with the few black customers in the line, asking more questions, requesting additional identification, little things that were clearly out of the ordinary. As Jasmine waited, she found herself observing the way people carried themselves, the unspoken rules of this place, Everyone seemed to know their role, their place. The invisible line between those who belonged and those who did not was clearly defined, and for all the shiny, welcoming appearances of Apex Bank, Jasmine began to see the cracks in its facade. When it was her turn, Jasmine stepped up to the counter, determined not to reveal her true identity. She kept her posture neutral, her expression calm, just another customer making a simple transaction. The teller, a man named James Foster, looked up from his computer screen as she approached. His expression was polite, but Jasmine could already sense the hesitation in his eyes as they flickered briefly over her, probably noting her simple attire and the way she presented herself. She slid her bank card across the counter, her request clear. "I'd like to withdraw $25,000, 0 cents from my personal account," she said smoothly, keeping her voice steady. The moment the words left her mouth, she noticed the shift in James's demeanor. His smile tightened ever so slightly, and he paused, looking at the card in his hand before scanning it into the system. "That's quite a large sum," he remarked, his tone still polite, but there was something under the surface, a flicker of suspicion that Jasmine couldn't ignore. "Do you have identification?" he asked, his eyes lingering on her face as if trying to gauge whether she was who she claimed to be. Jasmine was ready for this. She had expected this moment to come, and she had prepared for it. "Of course," she replied calmly, reaching into her bag and handing over her driver's license and bank card, both valid and in perfect standing. As she did, she noticed James taking extra care with the documents, holding them for just a bit longer than necessary, his fingers lightly pressing against the edges, as if weighing something unseen. "I'm going to need a secondary form of identification for security purposes," James added, his tone still polite, but the words felt like an almost mechanical response. Jasmine kept her expression neutral, but her mind raced. She had made this withdrawal countless times in the past, always without a hitch, always smooth and easy. But today, the scrutiny was different. Today, she was being treated like an outsider in her own institution. "Standard procedure," James continued, but Jasmine's eyes locked onto him. "Is it?" she asked, her voice quieter now, a subtle challenge hidden in the calmness. She glanced at the elderly man who had just finished his transaction at a nearby counter, watching as he left with a smile and a handshake, no additional questions asked. "I'm afraid so," James replied, his smile growing slightly strained. "It's for larger transactions, just to ensure everything is in order." Jasmine didn't push further. She had to pick her battles, and this was just the beginning. She was learning, observing, gathering what she needed to expose the truth. James excused himself, walking to the back office with her identification, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Jasmine remained calm, but the simmering anger inside her began to rise. This was it. This was the moment that confirmed everything she had feared. She was being scrutinized, delayed, and made to jump through unnecessary hoops simply because of who she was. She wasn't just a customer. She was the CEO of Horizon Financial, and she had come to see how the system worked for everyone else. But she wasn't ready to walk away just yet. She had a job to do, and she would see this through, no matter the discomfort it caused her. Jasmine waited in the sleek, polished lobby of Apex Bank, her eyes focused on the man behind the counter. The quiet hum of the air conditioning and the soft chatter of customers filled the space. But Jasmine's mind was far from calm. James had taken her identification and walked off to the back office, leaving her alone with her thoughts. As she waited, she couldn't help but replay the conversation in her head. "Security protocols," he had said, but the phrase sounded rehearsed, almost too convenient. She glanced around, her eyes flickering over the bank's immaculate interior, the expensive leather chairs, and the sleek marble countertops. This was supposed to be a place of trust, a place where wealth was managed seamlessly, where everyone who walked through the door was treated with respect. But Jasmine had seen something else, a subtle but unmistakable difference in how the bank's employees interacted with certain customers. She stood in line, feeling the weight of her position in this place she had helped build, now feeling like an outsider within it. The moment James returned, Jasmine's attention snapped back to the counter. He was holding her identification, his face unreadable. but his eyes flicked nervously toward the manager's office as he handed the documents back to her. "I've escalated your request," he said, his tone polite but distant. "The branch manager will need to approve this transaction before we proceed." Jasmine nodded, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she processed the words. She had seen this behavior before, heard the excuses, the justifications, but she had always been on the other side, never the one being scrutinized. As she waited, she turned her attention to the other customers in the bank. She saw a white man dressed in a crisp navy suit walk up to the counter and make his withdrawal. It was a significantly larger sum, $50,000, 0 cents, Jasmine estimated. But there was no hesitation from the teller, no request for additional identification. The transaction was processed smoothly, quickly, and without incident. Jasmine's breath caught in her chest as she watched the man leave with his money. No questions asked, no delays. Jasmine's pulse began to quicken. The disparity was glaringly obvious now. She had been subjected to a level of scrutiny for withdrawing a fraction of what the man had just taken without issue. The silent comparison stung like a slap in the face. Jasmine could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the realization creeping in. This wasn't just a simple oversight. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. No, this was systemic. This was bias, playing out in real time, right before her eyes. The teller had treated her with suspicion because of the color of her skin, while a white customer had walked away with a large sum without a second thought. She could almost hear the internal justifications that had been made in that split second, when James had hesitated, when he had asked for the second form of identification. Was it really about security, or was it a deeper, more ingrained bias that she could no longer ignore? She looked around the room, her eyes landing on another teller, a young black man who seemed to be having trouble with his transaction. The clerk was asking him questions, his voice lowering, and Jasmine could see the discomfort on his face. The young man didn't appear to be doing anything wrong, but still, there was a heightened level of suspicion that followed him. Jasmine turned away and tried to steady her breathing. This wasn't just her imagination. This was real. The disparities she had heard about, the biases others had tried to warn her about, were real, and they were playing out in the very place she owned. It was one thing to hear about discrimination. It was another thing entirely to experience it firsthand, in a place where she had once felt like an equal, like a leader. Jasmine shifted her weight, trying to keep her face neutral, trying to hide the sting of hurt and frustration she felt building inside her. She had worked too hard for this, for her success, for the ability to make a difference in the world. And now, here she was, facing the ugly truth about the very system she had hoped to reform. The bank she had founded had become a microcosm of the very thing she had fought against for so long. The small but significant acts of bias, both obvious and subtle, had woven their way into the very fabric of Apex Bank's operations, creating a culture of inequality that was deeply embedded, deeply ingrained. Jasmine exhaled slowly, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. There was no turning back now. She couldn't unsee what she had just witnessed. As the manager finally approached her, Jasmine knew this moment would change everything. She had seen the truth, and now she had to decide what to do with it. Would she continue to ignore the disparities, to allow the status quo to persist, or would she fight to dismantle the system she had once unknowingly helped to uphold? The answer was clear to her now. She would fight. Jasmine Turner was not a woman who sat idly by when injustice was present. She would take action, even if it meant confronting the uncomfortable truths about the company she had built. The battle had just begun. Jasmine stood in the center of the sleek, pristine lobby, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as she waited. James had taken her identification and disappeared into the back office to consult with the branch manager, Sarah Green. The air in the bank seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute as Jasmine tried to remain calm, her mind racing with frustration. The entire situation felt wrong on so many levels. Why was she being treated like this? It wasn't the first time she had encountered subtle forms of bias, but this was different. This was in her own institution, a bank she had built from the ground up. The realization was sinking in, and the more she stood there, the more she understood the full scope of the issue. She was witnessing something far bigger than one unintentional mistake. The longer the wait, the more she felt the growing pressure to do something about it. While she waited, Jasmine couldn't help but observe the other customers around her. Her eyes drifted over to a middle-aged Latino man who was speaking with a teller across the room. The conversation seemed strained, and he was being asked an unusual amount of questions for a simple transaction. His voice wavered as he answered, clearly uncomfortable. She noticed how his expression grew more guarded as the teller typed something into the computer, glancing nervously towards the branch manager's office. Jasmine's eyes then shifted to a white couple who approached the counter a few minutes later. They seemed to be withdrawing a large sum of money, at least $30,000, 0 cents. And yet there were no questions, no additional scrutiny. The teller barely even glanced at their IDs before swiftly processing their request. The disparity was glaring, and Jasmine's stomach twisted. It wasn't just a matter of one customer being delayed. It was a pattern, a bias embedded in the very processes of the bank. Jasmine fought to keep her composure, but the weight of what she was witnessing became harder to bear. The young man at the counter, who had been asked too many questions earlier, was still there, his face flushed, his patience clearly running thin. Jasmine wanted to intervene, to speak out against the injustice she could see unfolding before her. But she remained still, watching closely, knowing that she had to observe everything, to gather evidence. This wasn't just about her. This was about systemic issues that had been allowed to fester, that had been ignored for too long. Jasmine realized that her presence here was crucial, not just as the CEO of Horizon Financial, but as someone who had the power to make a change. She had to understand how deep this issue ran, how far-reaching the discrimination was, and how it was affecting not just the customers, but also the employees who were caught in the middle of it all. James returned, looking more nervous than before. He handed her identification back without saying much and told her that Sarah Green would need to approve her transaction. He didn't meet her eyes, and Jasmine could see that he was uncomfortable with the situation. She knew that James was just following orders, but what frustrated her even more was that he didn't seem to recognize the injustice in what was happening. He simply accepted it as part of the job, part of the system. Sarah Green, the branch manager, was now the key player in this unfolding drama, and Jasmine couldn't help but wonder if Sarah had any idea what was truly happening in her own branch. She hadn't seen Sarah yet, but Jasmine was determined to speak with her, to confront the person who held the power to change this. As she waited, her frustration continued to build, but so did her resolve. Jasmine's mind was already racing with what she needed to do next. She couldn't just let this slide. This wasn't just a matter of one bad experience, it was a sign of something far more insidious. She had seen enough, and she knew that it was time for action. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of the moment, Jasmine reminded herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to let her emotions drive her. She had to approach this with precision, with the clarity and focus that had gotten her to the top of Horizon Financial. She had always fought against the systems that tried to keep people like her from succeeding, and now she was seeing firsthand how deeply those same systems were embedded in the institutions she had once believed were neutral. The fight had just begun, and Jasmine Turner was ready to lead it. As Jasmine stood in the lobby, her mind was racing with everything she had witnessed so far. The delay, the scrutiny, the apparent racial bias in the system. Her frustrations were growing by the minute. But it was the conversation she overheard next that truly made the gravity of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. From her position, Jasmine could hear a tense exchange coming from the customer service area. A black woman, Alicia Thompson, was speaking to one of the managers, her voice edged with frustration. The words were indistinct at first, but as Jasmine leaned in slightly, she caught the tail end of Alicia's sentence. "This has happened to me before. Every time I try to withdraw money, I get delayed. No one ever tells me why, and I keep getting asked for extra documents that nobody else seems to need." Jasmine's heart sank. She'd hoped deep down that what she was seeing today was an isolated incident, a mistake that could be chalked up to a rogue employee's behavior. But Alicia's words made it clear that this was not just a one-time issue. This was a recurring problem, one that had been happening to her and, likely, many others. The manager standing across from Alicia, who appeared as indifferent as the tellers, was not offering any solution or explanation. Instead, he seemed to be brushing her off, offering vague platitudes about security protocols and standard procedures, just like the excuses Jasmine had heard earlier when she had been delayed. Jasmine could feel her pulse quicken as she realized the full extent of the problem. This wasn't just about her own personal experience. It was part of a broader systemic issue within Apex Bank. Alicia, clearly frustrated, continued speaking, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "I've been banking here for years," she said, "and I keep facing this. It's not just about the money. It's about the way I'm treated. It's like they don't want me here, don't want me to succeed. I've seen white customers in and out, no questions asked, but I get stopped every time." Alicia's words hit Jasmine hard. She had heard similar stories before, but never from someone so close. It was painful to hear the anguish in Alicia's voice, knowing that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and it was happening to people like Alicia every day. Jasmine knew in that moment that this was bigger than one poorly handled transaction or one employee's actions. It was a problem deeply embedded within the fabric of the bank, and it wasn't just happening at this branch. It was systemic. The discrimination was built into the very structure of the bank's operations, woven into their so-called procedures. The more she listened, the more Jasmine realized that this wasn't just a few rogue employees or misguided actions. It was institutionalized, ingrained in the practices of the institution itself. And worse, the people who had the power to stop it were either oblivious or too comfortable to address it. Alicia's words confirmed what Jasmine had feared. This was a problem that had been allowed to persist for far too long, and it needed to be addressed from the top down. Jasmine looked at Alicia, who was still trying to argue her case with the manager, but it was clear that nothing was going to change today. Jasmine's gut told her that it was up to her to fix this, to use her position and her power to challenge the system. But more than that, she needed to make sure that Alicia's voice, and the voices of countless others who had faced the same treatment, were heard. Jasmine took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she knew had to come next. This wasn't just a fight for fairness. It was a fight for the future of the bank, and a fight for the people who had been silenced for too long. Jasmine Turner was not about to let this injustice stand. Jasmine could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest as she watched Alicia continue to argue with the manager. But nothing seemed to change. The frustration was palpable, and Jasmine knew that if she didn't step in now, nothing would ever change. She took a steadying breath and walked toward the manager's desk, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. As she approached, she could see that the manager was growing increasingly impatient with Alicia, clearly dismissing her concerns. Without missing a beat, Jasmine interrupted the conversation. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm, carrying the authority of someone who commanded attention. The manager froze, momentarily startled by her presence. Turning to face the manager, Jasmine spoke directly. "I couldn't help but overhear what's going on here, and I have to say, I'm deeply troubled by the way this situation is being handled." The manager shifted uncomfortably, realizing that Jasmine wasn't just another customer, but someone with the power to make real change. Jasmine didn't wait for him to respond. "You're treating Alicia like her concerns don't matter. You're making her jump through hoops for her own money while others are given special treatment. This is not acceptable." Her eyes locked with his, and the pressure in the room seemed to rise, thickening the air. It was then that Sarah Green, the branch manager, appeared from the back office. She was wearing a composed expression, but her eyes flickered with recognition as she saw who had stepped in. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She turned to face Sarah and walked toward her, never breaking eye contact. "Sarah, I need to speak with you, now." Her voice was commanding, but the urgency in her tone left no room for argument. Sarah's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure and nodded, signaling for Jasmine to follow her to a more private area. The moment they were out of earshot, Jasmine wasted no time. "I want to know why Alicia is being treated this way. She's been banking with this institution for years, and yet she's being made to feel like a criminal for simply trying to access her own money. How can you justify this?" Jasmine's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of authority as she stood, unflinching, in front of Sarah. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, but Jasmine didn't give her the chance to evade the question. This kind of behavior isn't just a mistake. It's a reflection of a culture that allows people to be treated like they don't belong here simply because of their race. Jasmine's words landed with a sharpness that made Sarah visibly uncomfortable, and for a moment Jasmine saw a flicker of doubt in Sarah's eyes. Jasmine took a step forward, asserting her power as the CEO of Horizon Financial. As the CEO of this company, I will not stand by while people like Alicia are treated unfairly. This bank's practices, whether implicit or explicit, need to change, and they need to change now. I am demanding transparency in how transactions are handled, and I want a full review of your procedures and policies. We will not tolerate discrimination in any form. You can't hide behind security protocols when people's dignity is at stake. Jasmine's words were deliberate, her tone unwavering. Sarah remained silent for a moment, perhaps realizing that the gravity of the situation had shifted, but Jasmine wasn't finished. Jasmine wasn't just speaking as the CEO of Horizon Financial, she was speaking for all the marginalized customers who had been systematically excluded, ignored, and mistreated. She was taking a stand for justice, and she wasn't going to let the bank's leadership avoid accountability any longer. I expect answers within the next 24 hours. If this issue isn't resolved, I will take this matter further, both publicly and within the company. Jasmine paused, letting the weight of her words sink in, before turning to walk away, leaving Sarah to contemplate the magnitude of what had just been set in motion. Jasmine knew the battle was far from over, but today she had made her stand for justice, and she wasn't backing down. As Jasmine walked back into the lobby, her mind was racing with the weight of her confrontation with Sarah Green. She had made it clear that the bank's practices were unacceptable, but she knew the real challenge was yet to come. Sarah might have reluctantly acknowledged her concerns, but Jasmine knew she couldn't let this go. The longer she stood there, the more the frustration began to simmer within her. She watched Alicia as she stood at the counter, still visibly upset, still waiting. The entire experience felt like a broken system, one that had been in place far too long. Sarah Green followed Jasmine back into the lobby, her expression tight with discomfort. She glanced toward the tellers, her gaze landing on James Foster, the man who had originally delayed Jasmine's transaction. Sarah approached him with a forced calmness, her voice low, as if trying to downplay the situation. James, there's no need to escalate this any further. Just continue processing transactions as usual. We don't want to make this an issue. James nodded, but the hesitance in his eyes betrayed his discomfort. He understood that the situation was far from over. Jasmine wasn't going to let Sarah brush this off. She walked over to the counter, her steps deliberate, her presence impossible to ignore. James, she said, her voice steady but laced with authority. I'm still waiting for an explanation. Why did you delay my transaction while the person before me had no issues at all? Why was I treated differently? The question hung in the air, a challenge that James couldn't avoid. He fidgeted with the papers on the counter, avoiding Jasmine's unwavering gaze. Well, ma'am, it's just standard procedure for larger withdrawals. I'm sure you understand. His voice lacked confidence, almost as if he were reading from a script. Jasmine took a step closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. Standard procedure, she repeated, her tone tinged with disbelief. I watched the man in front of me withdraw, twice as much as I was asking for, without a single question. Why was I, as a customer of this bank, treated differently? If these are your policies, then why aren't they applied to everyone equally? James shifted nervously, glancing over his shoulder as though seeking support. But none came. Sarah had already retreated to the back office, and the rest of the staff seemed either unaware or unwilling to intervene. Jasmine's presence was undeniable, and her insistence was clear. I've worked my entire career fighting for equality, Jasmine continued, her voice becoming more firm with each word. And now, standing here in my own bank, I am being made to feel like I don't belong. I am asking you again. Why the extra scrutiny? Her words were sharp, filled with the kind of authority that she had earned over years of hard work and determination. She wasn't just questioning the bank's practices, she was challenging them. She refused to accept a system that singled out people like her, people of color, for no other reason than their appearance or background. James stood there, fumbling for a response, but none came quickly enough. His hesitation spoke volumes. Jasmine wasn't looking for excuses, she was looking for accountability. "I'm not leaving until I get an answer," she said, her voice resolute. "You may have been following some protocol, but I can see right through it. This is not about security. This is about discrimination, and I will not allow it to continue." The room seemed to freeze around them. The quiet hum of the bank, the soft clicking of keyboards, the shuffling of papers, all of it faded as Jasmine's words took center stage. James opened his mouth to speak, but Jasmine raised her hand, stopping him before he could offer another weak excuse. "You're going to get me the answers I need. You'll take me to the branch manager, or I will go to corporate. I'm done being ignored, James." The power in her voice left no room for argument. This wasn't just about one customer's inconvenience anymore. This was about exposing an injustice that had been allowed to fester for too long. "I will not back down," Jasmine added, her gaze unwavering. "Not until this is fixed." Jasmine stood in the middle of Apex Bank's lobby, her mind racing with the weight of what she had just witnessed. The interactions she had observed, the subtle but undeniable discrimination against Black and Latino customers, had cemented her belief that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a systemic issue, deeply embedded in the bank's practices. She had always prided herself on being a leader who acted decisively, and now, more than ever, she knew she had to take a stand. Standing in that pristine lobby, she couldn't ignore the burning sense of injustice that had been growing within her. This was her moment, not just to expose the problem, but to make real, lasting change. With a deep breath, Jasmine pulled out her phone and began typing out a message. It was time to take action. She needed a full review of all transactions at this branch, especially those involving Black and Latino customers. She wasn't going to let this go unnoticed, and she certainly wasn't going to let this kind of behavior continue under her watch. She had already seen enough to know that the discrepancies weren't accidental. They were deliberate. Jasmine knew that the numbers would speak for themselves. She had spent years working in the finance industry, and she knew how to navigate the system. This was the moment where she would push back against an entire industry built on inequalities. Jasmine's fingers tapped rapidly on the screen as she crafted an email to the internal audit team at Horizon Financial. She requested a full review of transaction data, with an emphasis on demographic breakdowns of withdrawals, loan rejections, and account verifications. She demanded transparency, pushing for a full investigation into the practices at Apex Bank. As she hit send, the weight of her decision settled on her. This wasn't just a request. It was a declaration of intent. She was going to hold the bank accountable, and she wasn't going to back down until she had answers. Jasmine knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that this was necessary. This was about more than just one branch. It was about the future of the entire financial institution. After sending the email, Jasmine took a moment to collect her thoughts. She began documenting everything she had observed that day. She wrote down the names of the employees involved, including James Foster and Sarah Green, along with the specific incidents that had raised her suspicions. She noted the customers who had been delayed, the ones who had been given unnecessary scrutiny, and the stark contrast between their treatment and that of the white customers. Jasmine knew that the evidence was crucial, but it also felt deeply personal. She had worked too hard to build her career, and to see people like Alicia Thompson treated this way, simply because of the color of their skin, was something Jasmine couldn't ignore. Jasmine's mind turned to the higher-ups at Horizon Financial. They had to be held accountable for the practices at Apex Bank. She would gather all the documentation she needed and present it to the board, demanding that they take action. This was no longer just about a single transaction or a single branch. This was about dismantling the systemic bias that was deeply embedded in the bank's operations. Jasmine's resolve was firm. She wasn't going to let the status quo continue. She wasn't going to stand idly by while people who looked like her, and like Alicia, were treated unfairly. Jasmine knew that the battle ahead would be tough, but she was ready. She had spent her career breaking barriers, and this was just another obstacle she was prepared to overcome. As she continued to document her findings, Jasmine thought about the larger implications of what she was doing. She wasn't just challenging a branch manager or a few rogue employees. She was challenging a system that had been in place for decades. This was bigger than Apex Bank. It was bigger than just one institution. Jasmine's actions could ripple across the entire financial industry, forcing other companies to reevaluate their practices. She was ready for that responsibility. She was ready to be the catalyst for the change that was so desperately needed. But first, she had to gather more evidence and build an unassailable case. She wasn't going to settle for half measures. She needed to make sure that when she took this to the top, there was no room for denial. With her documentation complete, Jasmine stood up from the desk in the back corner of Apex Bank. She had collected everything she needed to move forward. The path ahead was clear. She would return to Horizon Financial, armed with her findings, and demand that the company implement systemic changes. She would not let this matter go unnoticed, and she would make sure that no one else, whether at Apex Bank or any other branch of the financial institution, would be subjected to this kind of treatment again. Jasmine was ready to take the next step in her fight for justice, and she knew that it would be a battle worth fighting. Jasmine sat in her office at Horizon Financial, her fingers drumming steadily on the polished mahogany desk. The weight of the decisions she had made in the past few days weighed heavily on her, but she was resolute. The situation at Apex Bank wasn't something she could let slide. The racial discrimination she had witnessed was just the tip of the iceberg, and she wasn't going to allow this institutionalized bias to remain unchecked. Her decision was clear. An internal audit of Apex Bank was now the only way forward. It was time to bring the truth to light and hold those responsible accountable. As a CEO, Jasmine had faced difficult challenges before, but this was a matter of justice, and she was determined to see it through. Jasmine picked up her phone and dialed the number of her trusted compliance officer, Lisa Adams, who had been with Horizon Financial for years. Lisa answered after the first ring, her voice calm and professional. "Lisa, I need you to initiate a full internal audit at Apex Bank. I want to see everything, every transaction that has been flagged, every loan application that has been denied. We need a breakdown of the data by race, gender, and socioeconomic background. The board needs to see the extent of this problem." Jasmine's voice was firm, and Lisa responded with a brief but assured, "Understood, Jasmine. I'll get started immediately." Jasmine felt a sense of relief, knowing that the wheels were in motion. This wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about making sure that the truth couldn't be denied. As Lisa began gathering the necessary data, Jasmine made a few calls to other members of her leadership team. She needed to ensure that this audit would be as comprehensive as possible. She was meticulous in her request, asking for data on everything, from loan approval rates to flagged transactions that disproportionately affected minority customers. The data needed to be irrefutable, something that would make it impossible for anyone, especially those in Apex Bank's leadership, to argue against the truth. Jasmine knew the power of numbers. The evidence had to be clear and overwhelming. There could be no ambiguity when it came to the scale of the discrimination at Apex. In the meantime, Jasmine reflected on the conversations she had overheard at Apex Bank, the way the employees had treated her, the delays in her transaction, and the interactions with other marginalized customers. It all pointed to something systemic. The bank wasn't just doing this in a few isolated instances. This was their policy. Jasmine knew that by getting an audit, she would be able to prove beyond a doubt that Apex Bank's practices were not only discriminatory, but also deeply ingrained in their operations. If she could get this audit in front of Horizon's board of directors, she was confident they would have no choice but to act. As the data began to come in, Jasmine's worst fears were confirmed. The numbers didn't lie. There were clear discrepancies in how different racial groups were treated at Apex Bank. Black and Latino customers were subjected to additional scrutiny when making large withdrawals or applying for loans, while white customers were processed smoothly without any hindrances. In fact, the denial rates for loans among minority applicants were alarmingly higher than those for white applicants, even when their credit scores and financial histories were comparable. Jasmine looked over the preliminary figures and felt a surge of anger mixed with a sense of resolve. She had known this was happening, but seeing it laid out so plainly made it impossible to ignore. This was systemic, and it was up to her to dismantle it. Jasmine knew that her next steps were crucial. The data was now irrefutable, but she needed to be strategic in how she presented it. Horizon Financial's board of directors was a powerful group, but they were also traditional and risk-averse. She would need to ensure that the presentation of the data was precise and professional, leaving no room for misinterpretation or doubt. She had already planned her approach. A formal meeting with the board, where she would present the findings of the internal audit. Jasmine was prepared to stand her ground, to show the board exactly what was happening within their own company, and to make it clear that they could no longer allow this kind of discrimination to persist. She wasn't just fighting for justice for those at Apex Bank. She was fighting to restore integrity to Horizon Financial, to ensure that the values the company stood for were reflected in every branch and transaction. As Jasmine prepared to present the audit findings to the board, she felt a mixture of anticipation and determination. She had been in the finance industry long enough to know that exposing this kind of systemic injustice would not be easy. There would be resistance, there would be pushback. But Jasmine had spent her entire career breaking barriers and challenging the status quo, and she wasn't about to stop now. The stakes had never been higher, and she was ready to face them head-on. She would fight, not just for herself, but for the employees, the customers, and the communities that had been harmed by Apex Bank's discriminatory practices. This was a battle she couldn't afford to lose, and she wasn't going to back down until the change she knew was necessary was made. Jasmine was sitting at a small cafe near the Horizon Financial headquarters, sipping her coffee and reviewing the latest audit data. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't enough to take down the system on its own. She knew that she needed more. A network of allies within Apex Bank who were willing to stand up and expose the truth. She had seen how entrenched the discriminatory practices were, but she also knew that change needed to start from the inside. She had to find someone who was willing to challenge the status quo, someone with the courage to speak out. As she scrolled through her phone, an idea began to take shape in her mind. Noah Martinez. He was one of the young tellers she had observed during her undercover visit to Apex Bank. Despite the pressure, he had seemed different from the others, more thoughtful, more hesitant. Jasmine's instincts told her that he might be the key to unraveling the bank's culture of discrimination. The next day, Jasmine arranged to meet Noah at a small, discreet location close to Apex Bank. She knew this wasn't going to be easy for him. Speaking out against institutionalized practices wasn't just a matter of personal courage. It could mean risking his job, his career, and even his future in the industry. As Jasmine walked into the cafe, she spotted Noah sitting at a corner table, nervously fidgeting with his coffee cup. He looked up when she approached, a mixture of apprehension and hope in his eyes. Jasmine smiled warmly as she sat down across from him. "Noah, thank you for meeting me," she said softly, her tone reassuring. "I know this isn't easy, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. We're in this together." Noah nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he set down his cup. It was clear that the weight of the situation was taking a toll on him, but he was ready to talk. "I've been following the rules, you know," Noah began, his voice low and hesitant. "I've been doing my job the way I was told, but it's been eating at me. The way we treat certain customers, the way we question their withdrawals or deny their loans for no reason. It's not right. But every time I try to speak up, I get pushed back. I'm just a teller. What can I do?" Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes locked on Noah's, giving him the space to open up. "You can do a lot more than you think," she said, her voice firm but compassionate. "The system is built on silence, Noah. It's built on people like you feeling powerless, like you have no voice. But if we work together, we can change that. You're not alone in this, and I won't back down either." She could see the weight of his internal conflict reflected in his eyes, and she knew that this was the moment to offer him the encouragement he needed to take the first step. Noah looked down at his hands for a moment, his mind clearly wrestling with the implications of speaking out. "But what if they fire me?" he asked quietly. "What if I lose everything? I've got bills to pay, a family to take care of. I can't afford to lose my job." Jasmine reached across the table, placing her hand over his in a gesture of solidarity. "Noah, I understand the fear. I've been where you are. But sometimes the price of doing what's right is high, and it's never easy, but you have a chance to make a real difference. I'm with you every step of the way. If you speak out, I'll support you. I'll make sure your voice is heard, and we'll make sure you're protected. Jasmine's words carried the weight of her own experience, the long hours of fighting for fairness, and the unflinching resolve to make the world a better place. She saw the hesitation in Noah's eyes, but she also saw the flicker of something else. Look, Jasmine continued, her tone now more focused. I'm not asking you to go in alone. I need you to help me gather more evidence. I've seen what's happening, but I need the truth. What's really going on behind the scenes? If you help me, we can get this to the right people, and we'll expose what's happening at Apex Bank. It's not just about one teller or one transaction. It's about changing the system, Noah. If you're willing to stand with me, we'll make sure your voice counts. Noah sat quietly for a moment, processing everything Jasmine had said. Finally, he nodded, his expression hardening with determination. I'll do it, he said, his voice steady but tinged with the same fear he had shared earlier. I'll help you. I'll gather whatever I can. Jasmine smiled, feeling a surge of pride for the young man sitting across from her. Thank you, Noah. You're doing the right thing. Together, we'll make sure this ends. As their meeting concluded, Jasmine felt a sense of renewed purpose. She had found an ally, someone who was willing to risk everything to do what was right. With Noah's help, they would gather the evidence they needed to take down the corrupt practices at Apex Bank. But she knew the battle was far from over. The more they uncovered, the more powerful the resistance would be. Jasmine was prepared for the fight ahead. She had always believed that change could only happen when individuals stood up against injustice, no matter the cost. And now, with Noah by her side, she felt more confident than ever that they could bring the truth to light and make the changes that were long overdue. Jasmine sat in her office, the glow of her laptop casting a soft light across the otherwise dark room. Her mind raced as she sifted through the documents and emails she had requested from the internal audit. She had expected to find some level of discriminatory practices, but nothing could have prepared her for the magnitude of what she was uncovering. Page after page, email after email, it became painfully clear that the issues at Apex Bank ran far deeper than she had imagined. The corporate collusion was not just a series of isolated incidents, it was a systematic effort, carefully planned and executed by senior management. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read the latest email thread, sent from Richard Taylor, the senior vice president of Apex Bank, to a group of high-ranking executives. In it, he outlined policies that explicitly targeted minority communities. The wording was coded but unmistakable. Heightened scrutiny for clients in high-risk areas. Adjust criteria to ensure long-term sustainability, even if it means rejecting more minority applicants. Jasmine's stomach tightened as she processed the chilling realization that this had been the plan all along. The emails didn't stop there. As she continued scrolling, Jasmine discovered internal communications that discussed the implementation of policies designed to profile customers based on race and ethnicity. Richard Taylor, along with other senior executives, had created a framework that systematically denied services and loans to Black and Latino customers, even those with excellent credit. They justified these actions under the guise of risk management, but it was all too clear that the real risk was to their profits if they extended services to communities that were considered unpredictable. Jasmine felt a knot form in her chest. She had built Horizon Financial from the ground up, fighting for inclusivity and fairness in an industry that often overlooked those values. To see the exact opposite happening under her watch, within her own institution, was beyond disheartening. It was infuriating. The depth of the corruption, the calculated nature of the discrimination stunned her. It was not just a few rogue employees acting on their biases. This was corporate strategy at the highest levels. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling. She knew she had to act quickly. The information she had uncovered was damning, but it wasn't just about exposing one man or one policy. It was about the entire system. As she read through the emails, one thing became abundantly clear. Richard Taylor was at the center of it all. He had orchestrated the policies, encouraged the practices, and had done everything in his power to ensure that minority communities were systematically excluded from the bank's services. His role in this corporate collusion was undeniable. The more she read, the more Jasmine realized how deep the problem ran. This wasn't just a one-time issue at a single branch. It was embedded in the very fabric of Apex Bank. From loan approvals to credit assessments, everything had been designed to disadvantage certain groups, perpetuating a cycle of inequality that was perpetuated at every level of the company. Her thoughts raced as she began to make connections between the findings. This wasn't just about a few employees being complicit in discriminatory practices. It was the entire leadership structure that had fostered this toxic culture. Richard Taylor, a man she had once respected as a fellow leader in the financial industry, had turned out to be the architect of a scheme that had harmed so many. Jasmine felt a surge of anger, followed by an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She had spent her career fighting against these very practices, building an empire that stood for fairness and inclusion. Yet here was her own bank, undermining everything she stood for. The stakes had never been higher, and Jasmine knew that the time to act had arrived. This wasn't just a corporate issue, it was a moral one. As she continued to read, Jasmine found even more evidence that Richard Taylor's actions weren't isolated. They were part of a broader strategy to secure profits by excluding certain demographics from financial opportunities. The internal communications were filled with explicit instructions to deny loans to customers based on their race, to require additional documentation from Black and Latino clients, and to flag transactions that came from certain neighborhoods. These were not just procedural errors. They were deliberate actions designed to uphold a racist financial system that disproportionately affected people of color. Jasmine's hands clenched into fists as she digested the full extent of the situation. She had known there were issues within the bank, but the scale of the corruption was beyond anything she had anticipated. Jasmine sat there for what felt like an eternity, absorbing the reality of what she had uncovered. She had always known that the financial industry was built on systems of power and inequality, but to see that inequality playing out so clearly within her own company was a betrayal unlike any other. The question that lingered in her mind was, what would she do now? The evidence she had gathered was irrefutable. There was no denying the systemic nature of the problem. Nor could she ignore the fact that Richard Taylor, the very person who was supposed to be a role model within the company, was at the heart of it. She knew that exposing this issue would come with consequences, huge ones, but Jasmine was no stranger to challenges. This fight was hers, and she would see it through to the end. With newfound resolve, she began to draft a plan of action. She would take this to the board, to the public, and if necessary, to the courts. She would make sure that the truth came to light and that the people responsible for this corporate collusion were held accountable. The path ahead would be difficult, but Jasmine was ready for the fight of her life. Jasmine entered the sleek, glass-walled office of Richard Taylor with a purposeful stride. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floors, her every step exuding the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years building her career from the ground up. She had prepared herself for this moment, knew that it was coming. And yet, as she entered his space, she felt the weight of what was at stake. Richard Taylor, Senior Vice President of Horizon Financial, a man she had once respected, sat behind his massive desk. His posture was relaxed, confident, almost smug, as if he had already won. But Jasmine wasn't about to let him get away with it. The walls of the room, decorated with rich mahogany and silver accents, felt suffocating now, as she stood at the center of it all. "Richard," she began, her voice steady but sharp, "we need to talk about Apex Bank and the practices you've been overseeing." Richard didn't look up from his desk immediately. He adjusted his tie with one hand, his face displaying a mix of indifference and faint curiosity. Finally, he met her eyes, his lips curling into a practiced smile. "Jasmine," he said with a slight nod, "I assume this is about the ongoing audit. I've seen some of your reports, and I'm sure we can clear up any misunderstandings. You know how the industry works, right? These policies are standard for banks like ours." His tone was dismissive, as though her concerns were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Jasmine's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She had spent far too long in this industry to be intimidated by someone like Richard. This wasn't just about policies, it was about the lives affected by those policies. "No, Richard," she replied, her words cutting through the air with authority. "These policies aren't just standard, they're discriminatory, and you've had a hand in creating them." Richard's expression shifted slightly, but his composure remained unshaken. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, as if to assert control over the conversation. "Jasmine, with all due respect, you're jumping to conclusions. What you're calling discrimination is just risk management. We assess risk, we mitigate loss. These practices are in place to protect the bank's bottom line and ensure long-term sustainability." He paused, as if waiting for her to nod in agreement, but Jasmine's face remained impassive. "I've read the emails, Richard," she said, her voice unwavering. "I've seen the internal communications where you and your team explicitly instructed employees to scrutinize Black and Latino customers more than others. I've seen the data. This is not about risk management, it's about systemic racism." Richard's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation passing through him. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk, and stared at her with a cold, calculating gaze. "You're making this personal," he said, his voice low. "This is just how business is done. No one is going to change it. Not now, not ever. If you think you can just walk in here and change everything with a few complaints, you're wrong." Jasmine's resolve hardened as she took a step closer, refusing to let him intimidate her. "No, Richard. I've spent my career fighting for equality, for fairness, and for people who don't have a voice. I won't let you or anyone hide behind industry standards to justify this. Your actions have gone far beyond acceptable practices, and it stops now." The tension in the room thickened as the weight of her words hung in the air between them. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously against the desk. For the first time since the conversation had begun, he seemed less sure of himself. "You don't understand," he muttered, looking down at his hands. "This is the way things have always been. People like you and me, we don't get to change the system overnight. It's bigger than both of us." Jasmine's expression softened for a brief moment, but her voice remained firm. "I understand more than you think," she said quietly. "I understand that the system is broken, and I understand that I have the power to fix it. We're not going to let this go on any longer. Not under my watch." She paused, letting the silence stretch between them before continuing. "I'm going to take this to the board, Richard, and I'm going to make sure this gets exposed, no matter how far it goes. You can't hide behind your policies anymore." Richard's face flushed with anger, but Jasmine stood her ground. "You've had your chance to do the right thing," she said, her eyes locked on his. "Now it's my turn, and this ends with you, Richard. You're going to be held accountable for what you've done." The words hung in the air, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Richard's jaw clenched, and Jasmine knew that she had struck a nerve. He knew she was serious. This wasn't a conversation about corporate policies anymore. It was about justice. It was about doing what was right, and Jasmine wasn't going to back down, no matter what. Jasmine walked into the boardroom with the weight of the truth heavy in her hands. The folder she carried, thick with evidence, felt like the final piece of the puzzle. She had gathered emails, internal memos, and communications from Richard Taylor and other senior executives that revealed the deep-rooted discriminatory practices at Apex Bank. She had spent countless hours going through the files, each document confirming her worst fears about the company she had once believed in. Today, she would expose the truth, no longer willing to let these practices remain hidden behind corporate jargon and industry excuses. She knew the board was going to be shocked, but she was ready. As she stepped to the front of the room, she turned to face Richard, her expression unwavering. "Richard," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I've gathered all the evidence we need. It's time you answer for what's been happening at Apex Bank." She opened the folder and placed it on the table, pulling out the carefully compiled documents one by one. The emails, dated back over several months, were damning. They outlined specific instructions given to employees on how to flag Black and Latino customers for additional scrutiny, as well as directives to deny certain transactions without proper cause. The memos spoke of risk management, complicated protocols, but the language was unmistakable. This was a pattern of discrimination, not business practice. As she laid each document in front of Richard, Jasmine could see the color drain from his face. His usual smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by a look of unease. The board members were silent, their eyes flicking between the documents and Richard. They were seeing it all for the first time, and the implications were enormous. Jasmine didn't break eye contact with Richard, holding him accountable with every word. BD documents are just the beginning, Richard. The truth is out there. You've built a system designed to target specific communities, to make it harder for people who look like me to access basic services. This is no longer a question of business. It's about injustice. Richard shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously against the surface of the table. He tried to gather his composure, but it was clear that the evidence was taking its toll. He had always been careful, manipulating the system from behind the scenes, but now the walls were closing in. "Jasmine, you don't understand," he said, his voice shaky. This was never about race. These policies were put in place to protect the bank's interests. Risk management is what keeps us profitable. If we let everyone in, if we lower our standards, we'd be losing millions. This isn't personal, it's business. His argument was weak, and Jasmine wasn't buying it. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, understanding how business worked, and she knew that what Richard was saying didn't hold up. "No, Richard," she responded firmly. "This isn't about protecting the bank. This is about perpetuating a system that keeps certain people in the dark. It's about denying people their rights because of the color of their skin. And that's something I will never stand for." The board members were beginning to murmur among themselves, the tension in the room rising. Richard's attempts to justify his actions had fallen flat, and Jasmine wasn't backing down. "I've given you every chance to come clean," she continued, her voice unwavering. "But now it's time for you to face the consequences. You've built this system on a foundation of lies and deceit, and I'm not going to let it continue." Jasmine paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. Richard was visibly sweating now, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "This ends today, Richard," Jasmine said, her tone final. "You have one last chance to come clean. If you don't, I'll take this matter public and the entire world will know what you've done. You can't hide behind your policies anymore. The truth is here, and I'm ready to expose it all." The room was silent, the gravity of the situation settling in. Jasmine stood tall, her resolve stronger than ever. Richard had a choice to make: confess and face the consequences, or try to cover it up and face the fallout from the public. Richard was trapped. He knew that Jasmine had the power to destroy everything he had built. His mind raced, but no excuse seemed to work. His usual tactics were failing him, and for the first time he was at a loss for words. The silence stretched between them, thick with the tension of an impending decision. Jasmine's eyes never left his, and she didn't flinch as Richard finally spoke. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just following orders, trying to protect the bank, but I see now it's wrong." Jasmine didn't show any signs of relief. His confession, however reluctant, was just the first step. "I need more than just words, Richard. You've built a system of injustice. It's time to fix it." She turned to the board, her voice rising with authority, "And I will ensure that the changes we need are implemented. I won't stop until this system is dismantled and replaced with something better, something that reflects the values we should be upholding as a company." The room was silent, but Jasmine knew she had won this battle. Now, the real work was just beginning. As Jasmine prepared to take decisive action, she knew the storm that was brewing inside Horizon Financial was inevitable. Her findings, irrefutable proof of discrimination deeply embedded in Apex Bank's practices, were now in the hands of the board of directors. The documents were clear, the evidence overwhelming, and Jasmine was determined to confront the truth, no matter the cost. But as she sat in the sleek, imposing boardroom, a sense of unease hung in the air. The senior executives and board members, once supporters of her, now looked at her with suspicion. It was clear that her decision to expose Apex Bank's corrupt practices had ruffled more than a few feathers. There was an air of resistance, thick with the tension of a battle over control of the company's future. As the meeting began, Jasmine could feel the pressure mounting. A few of the executives were already murmuring among themselves, eyes flicking between the files on the table and her, silently questioning the direction she was about to take. "Jasmine, you need to consider the implications of this," said William Hargrove, a senior director with a reputation for being conservative and cautious. His tone was measured, but there was an undeniable undercurrent of concern. "Exposing this kind of information could destroy our reputation. Our investors, our partners, they won't stand for this. You're talking about taking down a whole institution, not just a few rogue employees. We could lose everything." His words were sharp, but Jasmine stood tall, her posture unwavering. She knew the stakes, and she wasn't intimidated. For years, she had worked tirelessly to build this company into something successful, something that could change lives for the better. But now she was faced with a reality that threatened to undo it all. She understood the risks, but she also understood the consequences of inaction. If she allowed the systemic racism and corruption to persist, Horizon Financial would become complicit. The truth needed to come out, and she was the only one who could make it happen. "William," Jasmine began, her voice firm but calm, "this isn't about protecting an image, it's about integrity. We cannot continue to allow practices that harm people, particularly those in marginalized communities. The truth is here, and we need to face it head-on. If we choose to ignore it for the sake of maintaining our reputation, we'll be sacrificing everything we've worked for. This company was built on the premise of fairness, of inclusion, and if we abandon those values now, we lose everything that matters." A heavy silence fell over the room. She could see the unease creeping across the faces of the other board members, their discomfort palpable as they absorbed the weight of her words. Jasmine knew that some of them were beginning to question her leadership. The old guard, those who had benefited from the system as it was, didn't want to change. They feared the fallout, the media attention, the public backlash. But Jasmine had spent her entire life fighting for justice, for the right to have her voice heard, and she wasn't about to back down now. "I've always been transparent with you all," Jasmine continued, her gaze sweeping over the room. "I've never been afraid of doing the hard thing, and today is no different. Yes, the fallout will be severe, but that doesn't change the fact that we need to act. The system at Apex Bank is broken. It's discriminatory, and it's harming the very people we claim to serve. We can't hide behind our profits any longer. We have a responsibility, not just as a financial institution, but as human beings, to do the right thing." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment she could see the conflict playing out in their eyes. Some were beginning to waver, their initial resistance faltering as they realized the depth of the issue. But others, particularly those with the most to lose, remained steadfast in their concerns. She could feel the divide growing, the tension thickening as some of the most influential voices in the room began to challenge her leadership. "We built this company on trust," said Richard Taylor, the senior vice president of Horizon Financial, his voice tinged with frustration. "And now you want to tear it down based on a few incidents? This is the kind of thing that gets blown out of proportion. It's not as bad as you're making it seem. Do we really want to risk everything for the sake of a few customers?" Jasmine's eyes locked onto his, and she could see the defensiveness in his posture. He was part of the problem, a man who had long benefited from the status quo. He was afraid of what might happen if the truth came out, afraid of losing his power, his position. But Jasmine was resolute. "It's not just a few customers, Richard. This is systemic, and it's been going on for far too long. I won't sit idly by and allow this company to continue operating with blinders on. We have a chance to change, and if we don't take it, we will be no better than the system we claim to oppose." Her voice was steady, unwavering, as she laid it all on the line. This was her moment of truth, and she wasn't about to let fear or resistance stop her from doing what was right. As the meeting continued, Jasmine could feel the mounting pressure. Some of the board members began to soften, the weight of her words starting to settle in. Others, however, doubled down on their resistance, unwilling to face the consequences of the truth. She could see the divide growing, but Jasmine remained confident. She knew that the only way forward was to dismantle the corrupt system at Apex Bank. She was prepared to fight for the values she had always believed in, no matter the cost. Her mind was clear. The truth had to come out, and she was willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. The future of Horizon Financial, and the future of countless individuals who had been wronged by the system depended on it. Jasmine's resolve was unshakable. No matter how much resistance she faced, she would not back down. This fight was just beginning, and she was ready to see it through to the end. Jasmine's decision to take her fight to the public was not one she made lightly. After weeks of gathering irrefutable evidence, confronting the board of directors, and facing resistance at every turn, she realized that the only way to bring about the change she envisioned was by shining a spotlight on the practices at Apex Bank. She understood the risks involved, the potential damage to her own reputation, and the harsh scrutiny she would face from the media. But Jasmine was done playing by the rules of an unjust system. This wasn't just about a single bank or a few bad policies. It was about exposing a deep-rooted problem within the financial industry that disproportionately impacted Black and Latino communities. Jasmine knew that silence would only perpetuate the problem. It was time for the truth to come to light, and she was going to ensure that it did, no matter the cost. Jasmine took to the stage in front of a crowd of reporters, journalists, and cameras, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had already issued a formal statement, but this speech would be her personal declaration. She stood tall, her voice steady but filled with conviction as she addressed the media. "Today, I stand before you not just as the CEO of Horizon Financial, but as a woman who has dedicated her life to fighting for fairness and equality. For too long, Apex Bank has hidden behind the guise of industry standards, all the while perpetuating a system that excludes and discriminates against people based on the color of their skin." The words hung in the air, and Jasmine felt the eyes of the world upon her. This was her moment, the culmination of all her hard work, and she wasn't about to waste it. "Financial inclusion is not just a buzzword," Jasmine continued, her gaze unwavering. "It is a fundamental right that every individual deserves. We cannot continue to allow institutions like Apex Bank to enforce policies that harm entire communities, that deny access to basic financial services simply because of racial biases. The truth is clear. The practices at Apex Bank were not isolated incidents. They were systemic, and they were wrong. But I am here today to tell you that this ends now." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Her hands gripped the podium, her resolve growing stronger as she looked out over the crowd. "I am calling on all financial institutions to follow my lead. It's time for us to dismantle the systems of oppression that exist in the banking industry. We must be the change we wish to see in the world." The room was silent for a moment, and then the questions began. Some reporters praised her bravery, applauding her for exposing the truth and standing up to a corrupt system. Others, however, were less kind. Critics from all sides of the financial world began to question her decision, accusing her of jeopardizing the future of Horizon Financial for the sake of a moral crusade. "You're damaging the reputation of one of the most powerful financial institutions in the country," one reporter from a major financial news outlet asked, her voice sharp. "What do you say to those who claim that your actions are reckless, that this will have a lasting negative impact on Horizon's future?" Jasmine's answer was simple and firm. "I say that sometimes doing the right thing requires risk. But in the long run, what's more damaging, exposing the truth or perpetuating a system that continues to hurt marginalized communities?" Her words were met with a mixture of murmurs and applause from the audience. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Jasmine was steadfast in her determination. She wasn't about to let the fear of criticism or failure stop her from fighting for what was right. As the media storm continued to grow, Jasmine found herself at the center of a whirlwind of praise and backlash. The public response was overwhelming. Some hailed her as a hero, a trailblazer who was willing to sacrifice everything to create meaningful change. Others accused her of being reckless, of jeopardizing the financial stability of an entire industry for the sake of a moral high ground. But Jasmine, unfazed by the criticism, remained resolute. She knew that she was on the right side of history, and that the only way to create lasting change was to expose the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be for those in power. She wasn't afraid of the spotlight. She embraced it, knowing that the attention was a necessary catalyst for the reforms she wanted to see. Over the next few weeks, Jasmine continued to push for change, using her platform to speak out against the discriminatory practices that had been ingrained at Apex Bank. She met with lawmakers, industry leaders, and activists, all while continuing to work with her team at Horizon Financial to ensure that the company's internal policies were aligned with the values of inclusion and equality. Jasmine was aware that the battle wasn't over, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. She had opened a door, and there was no turning back. It wasn't just about one bank. It was about an entire industry, an entire system that needed to be overhauled. And Jasmine was ready to lead the charge, no matter how difficult the path ahead might be. The public support Jasmine received was heartening, but it was the conversations that were happening behind closed doors that gave her the most hope. Across the financial world, institutions were beginning to take notice. Some of them were quietly reaching out, asking for guidance on how to create more inclusive practices within their own organizations. Others were already beginning to implement changes, though far more cautiously than Jasmine had hoped for. Still, the ripple effect was undeniable. What started as a personal crusade had grown into a movement, and Jasmine was at its helm. She was changing the financial industry from the inside out. And as the weeks passed, it became increasingly clear that the fight she had started was far from over. It was only just beginning. As Jasmine's public stand gained momentum, the media frenzy that followed was both exhilarating and overwhelming. News outlets across the country picked up the story, with headlines reading, "CEO shakes up banking industry with bold move. Jasmine Turner exposes discriminatory practices at Apex Bank," and "Financial world in turmoil after CEO's call for change." Jasmine had not only exposed a deep-seated problem within Apex Bank, but had also sparked a nationwide conversation about racial discrimination within the financial industry. The shockwave from her public speech rippled through the media, stirring a wave of reactions from every corner of the industry. Analysts, pundits, and commentators discussed the implications of Jasmine's actions, while some questioned her approach, arguing that it could damage the stability of the financial sector. But for every voice of dissent, there were many more in support of Jasmine's fight for justice. People applauded her courage, her determination to stand up to an industry that had for far too long been complicit in perpetuating systemic racism. In the days that followed, Jasmine's phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, activists, and organizations, all eager to support her cause. But it wasn't just the media that was paying attention. Minority customers, those who had been subjected to similar discriminatory treatment by Apex Bank and other financial institutions, began to speak out. These were people who had lived through the injustice Jasmine had exposed, and now, emboldened by her actions, they were sharing their stories. Black and Latino customers flooded social media, recounting their experiences of being denied loans, facing excessive scrutiny when withdrawing money, and being treated with suspicion simply because of their race. Their voices, once silenced by a system that worked against them, were now being heard. Jasmine was no longer just a lone figure standing up against the system. She had become the face of a larger movement for financial inclusion and equality. The flood of testimonials only strengthened her resolve and proved that the problem she had uncovered was far from an isolated incident. It was a widespread, deeply ingrained issue within the banking industry that needed to be addressed. The public reaction to Jasmine's bold move was overwhelmingly positive, with many expressing their support for her fight. Activists, civil rights leaders, and social justice organizations rallied behind her, organizing protests and petitions calling for systemic change. The hashtag Financial Justice for All trended on social media as people from all walks of life shared their stories of discrimination and rallied for reforms in the banking industry. Jasmine was not only leading a fight for equality in financial services, but had sparked a larger discussion about the broader issues of systemic racism in corporate America. Her actions were not just about exposing one bank's corrupt practices. They were about challenging a system that allowed these practices to continue unchecked. The weight of this cause was becoming increasingly clear to Jasmine, and though the pressure was mounting, she knew she was on the right path. But Jasmine also realized that her fight was far from over. As the media continued to shine a spotlight on her and the discrimination she had uncovered, The pressure mounted on other financial institutions to examine their own practices. The public demand for change grew louder, and more customers came forward, revealing the extent to which racial profiling and discriminatory policies were entrenched within the banking sector. The stories they shared ranged from being denied simple financial services to facing humiliation and undue suspicion, and they all pointed to the same systemic issues. Financial institutions, once confident in their ability to operate behind closed doors, were now under intense scrutiny. The industry was on edge, with many of its leaders scrambling to respond to the growing public outcry. Some institutions were quick to announce reviews of their practices, while others remained silent, unsure of how to navigate the new reality Jasmine had created. As the weeks went by, Jasmine began to see the true impact of her actions. Financial institutions that had once been complacent in their discriminatory practices were now being forced to reconsider their policies. Calls for greater transparency, inclusivity, and fairness in financial services were being heard louder than ever before. Jasmine's efforts were starting to bear fruit as other banks began to adopt more inclusive hiring practices, introduce diversity training, and reassess their customer service protocols. But Jasmine knew that this was only the beginning. The battle for true financial equity would not be won overnight, but she was determined to see it through. She had ignited a spark, and now she had to ensure that it would grow into a blaze that would forever change the landscape of the banking industry. The public's reaction was a clear message to the financial world. The status quo was no longer acceptable. As the pressure on other institutions grew, it became clear that those who failed to adapt would face serious consequences. Jasmine had proven that even the most entrenched systems of power could be challenged, and that the voices of the marginalized could no longer be ignored. She had changed the conversation, forcing the financial industry to confront the discrimination it had long turned a blind eye to. While the road ahead remained uncertain, Jasmine's resolve was stronger than ever. The media frenzy had made her cause a national conversation, but it was the countless individuals who had come forward to share their stories that truly solidified the movement. With each passing day, Jasmine felt the weight of her mission, but she was no longer carrying it alone. She had a growing army of supporters, and together they would continue to push for the systemic changes that were so desperately needed. As Jasmine continued her fight for financial justice, the internal repercussions within Horizon Financial began to unfold. Some investors and senior executives, who had initially been supportive of her leadership, began to voice their concerns. The fallout from her public stand against Apex Bank's discriminatory practices was starting to be felt across the company, with many fearing that Jasmine's bold actions could harm Horizon Financial's bottom line. The stock price, once on a steady rise, began to experience volatility as the news spread, and whispers of uncertainty started to circulate among the company's high-profile investors. They were worried that the public backlash, especially from the banking sector's old guard, would lead to long-term damage. Investors, accustomed to seeing their shares steadily increase in value, were now questioning whether Jasmine's approach to corporate responsibility was worth the financial risk. As the pressure from the external media grew, so too did the resistance within her own company, creating a perfect storm of doubt and fear that threatened to unravel everything Jasmine had worked for. Behind closed doors, board members and shareholders gathered to discuss the implications of Jasmine's actions. The usual calm of the executive meetings had been replaced with tense debate as some members questioned her judgment. "We need to consider the ramifications," one of the more seasoned board members, Robert Clark, said, his voice laced with concern. "This could affect our reputation. If Horizon is associated with this scandal, it's not just Apex that will suffer, it's us too. The financial world isn't known for embracing disruption, and these kinds of moves don't come without consequences." Other shareholders joined in, expressing their fears that Jasmine's public fight could damage the company's image in the eyes of both investors and potential clients. "What about our long-term sustainability?" another board member, Sarah Winters, asked. "We have to consider whether this move will alienate customers who don't want to be associated with a company embroiled in controversy." Jasmine listened intently as her colleagues debated, but beneath the tension, she could feel the weight of their disapproval, and she knew that the very foundation of her leadership was being questioned. Despite the mounting internal opposition, Jasmine stood firm in her beliefs. She knew that the cost of doing what was right often came with sacrifice, but she wasn't willing to back down. As she sat in that tense boardroom, with everyone around her questioning her decisions, she reminded herself of why she had started this fight in the first place. True leadership is about making tough decisions, she thought. It's about standing up for what is right, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges the status quo. Jasmine had worked her entire career to break down the barriers that existed for people like her in the financial world. Now that she was in a position of power, she knew it was her responsibility to do more than just lead. It was her duty to push the industry toward fairness and inclusion. While the resistance from within Horizon Financial was significant, Jasmine understood that true change didn't come without challenges. She was determined to prove that leadership was not just about making the right moves for the company's bottom line, but about making a real impact on society and pushing for the systemic changes that were so long overdue. As Jasmine prepared to face the next round of questions and concerns from the board, she reminded herself that her values were more important than corporate profits. She had worked tirelessly to reach this point in her career, but it had always been about more than just financial success. It had been about creating a legacy of integrity. The financial industry, with its history of inequality and exclusion, needed reform, and Jasmine had decided that she would be the one to lead that change, no matter the personal cost. The meeting dragged on, with more questions from shareholders and more resistance from those who had once supported her. "We can't ignore the long-term effects of this," said Thomas Hardy, a major investor. "There's a reason the system is the way it is. It's worked for decades. Why disrupt it now?" Jasmine could feel the room closing in on her, but she didn't flinch. This was the moment she had been preparing for, and she wasn't about to let her values be compromised for the sake of corporate comfort. Jasmine's confidence only grew as the board meeting continued, despite the growing tension. She knew that her role as CEO wasn't just about managing the day-to-day operations of Horizon Financial. It was about setting a precedent for the entire industry. She could already see the long-term benefits of the changes she was pushing for, even if they were difficult to achieve. "If we are truly a company that values diversity, equity, and inclusion," she said, her voice calm but unwavering, "then we cannot let the fear of short-term losses dictate our future. We have an opportunity to be a leader in corporate responsibility. We can make a difference, not just for Horizon Financial, but for the entire banking industry." Jasmine's words hung in the air, and as the meeting progressed, she realized that not all of her colleagues were ready to embrace her vision. Some remained entrenched in their fears of what this fight might cost them, but others were beginning to see the potential for real change. Slowly, the balance in the room began to shift. The internal resistance continued to mount, but Jasmine's resolve remained unshaken. She understood that this was not just about one company or one CEO. It was about the future of an entire industry. As the media spotlight intensified and the pressure from both within and outside Horizon Financial continued to rise, Jasmine knew that she could no longer be silent. This was her moment, and she was ready to face whatever came next. With each passing day, the impact of her decision was becoming clearer, not just in the financial world, but in the broader fight for equality and justice. Jasmine had become a symbol of what it meant to challenge the status quo, and despite the resistance, she was more determined than ever to push forward, no matter the cost. Jasmine's decision to stand firm in the face of adversity and her determination to confront the deep-rooted biases in the financial system began to ripple through the entire industry. As Horizon Financial's bold stance on discrimination gained traction, it became a catalyst for broader change. Financial institutions across the country, many of whom had remained silent or complacent for years, began to take notice. What started as one woman's stand against systemic inequality evolved into a much larger movement. Jasmine's leadership didn't just impact Apex Bank, it sparked a revolution within the financial sector, urging other banks to examine their own practices and question the unspoken rules that had for so long dictated the way they did business. It became clear that Jasmine's commitment to financial equity had set the stage for a new era, where inclusivity, fairness, and transparency would no longer be optional. but required. As other financial institutions looked on, they realized that they had no choice but to follow suit or risk falling behind in a rapidly changing landscape. In the wake of Jasmine's actions, the financial industry was forced to confront its own biases and reevaluate the systems that had historically harmed marginalized communities. The outdated risk assessment models that banks had relied upon for decades, which disproportionately harmed Black and Latino communities, were now under intense scrutiny. These models, which had been cloaked under the guise of risk management, were exposed as tools of exclusion rather than protection. For too long, financial institutions had justified their practices as necessary for mitigating risk. But Jasmine's relentless pursuit of justice made it clear that these systems were fundamentally flawed. Across the industry, other leaders began to publicly acknowledge the need for change, albeit hesitantly. Some were quick to embrace the notion of financial equity, recognizing the long-term benefits of fairness and inclusion, while others struggled to let go of the familiar profit-driven models that had sustained them for so long. However, the pressure was undeniable. Jasmine's influence had made it clear that the status quo could no longer be maintained if banks were to survive in a world that demanded justice. Jasmine's influence spread beyond just Apex Bank and Horizon Financial. Her courage to challenge one of the most entrenched sectors of the economy set a powerful example for others to follow. As financial institutions grappled with the implications of her actions, they began to examine their own practices, many of which had been deeply flawed for years. Banks started to revise their risk assessment models, ensuring that these systems no longer disproportionately impacted minority communities. Some began implementing more inclusive lending practices, offering opportunities to individuals who had long been excluded from the financial mainstream. Others overhauled their customer service protocols, training employees to recognize and combat bias at every level. Jasmine's fight had become a defining moment in the movement for financial equity, as her leadership forced the industry to reckon with its past mistakes and embrace a more just and equitable future. Jasmine's personal sacrifice had led to widespread reform, setting the stage for a transformation in how banks interacted with and supported their community. As more banks took steps to rectify the systemic issues that Jasmine had exposed, the financial landscape began to shift. What was once seen as a niche movement focused on fairness and equity became a mainstream priority. Investors, customers, and even government agencies started to demand that financial institutions adopt more inclusive and transparent practices. The once taboo discussions about racial discrimination and inequality within the banking sector became central to industry conversations, not just in boardrooms but in communities across the country. Jasmine's leadership helped create a ripple effect that was felt across sectors. Non-profits, advocacy groups, and grassroots organizations began to work more closely with financial institutions, helping to ensure that the needs of marginalized communities were heard and met. The tide of change was no longer a distant hope. It had become a reality, fueled by the actions of one determined woman. Jasmine's actions transformed not only Apex Bank, but also the broader financial sector. Her work set a precedent for how companies should operate in a world where social justice, equality, and financial access were paramount. The banking system that had once prioritized profit over people was now being held accountable for its practices, and the public was taking notice. The pressure to change came from all sides. Customers demanded it, employees stood behind it, and the media spotlight continued to shine on the issue. But perhaps the most significant change was the way Jasmine reshaped the future of the entire industry. No longer would financial institutions operate in secrecy, hiding behind outdated models and exclusionary practices. Instead, Jasmine's commitment to transparency and inclusion had created an industry-wide push for more equitable financial systems that genuinely served everyone, not just the privileged few. The future of the financial sector was now one where justice and equality were integral parts of the system, thanks to Jasmine's leadership. The lasting impact of Jasmine's efforts went far beyond just financial equity. It inspired a new generation of leaders who saw the potential for real change within an industry that had long been resistant to reform. Her actions reminded everyone that leadership wasn't just about numbers or profits. It was about making a difference, standing up for what's right, and having the courage to face the challenges that come with fighting for equality. As Jasmine looked back on the journey she had started, she knew that the work wasn't over. There would always be more battles to fight, but the financial industry had been irrevocably changed, and Jasmine Turner had shown the world that true leadership meant breaking down the walls that divide us and building a future where financial opportunity was accessible to all. If you're inspired by the powerful journey of Jasmine Turner and want to see more stories of leadership, transformation, and standing up for justice, don't forget to subscribe to Deep Inside HQ. Join us as we uncover real stories that challenge the status quo, spark change, and inspire you to take action. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Let's create a future where fairness and equity are at the forefront together.